Hey everyone, happy Monday. Welcome to another edition of Sports Speak. I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And I'm Tim Moore.
An interesting weekend in the world of sports. We had a golf major, basketball, hockey, baseball, a lot of excitement. And just like last week, I'm going to start things off with an SEC recap where we go through our surprise, something that happened that is expected, and a conclusion from the weekend. And then afterwards, we're going to be talking Ramon Laureano fallout after the fight between the Astros and A's, and also college football because there's been a lot of news today. We're recording just after 2 o'clock today. So when this airs at 7 o'clock, news might be a little different. I've got Twitter here just to keep updated because there's been a lot of changes. Even President Trump has chimed in just moments ago on the matter. So we're going to try to stay as updated as possible on that. But let's get into the SEC recap first. My surprise, I'm going to start with hockey, and that is that both host teams in Canada have been eliminated while playing at home. The Maple Leafs were just taken out in a 5-game series by Columbus, and then Edmonton, who was the 5 seed in the West, taken out by the old Chicago Blackhawks. We talked about this on Thursday. I'm shocked that both Edmonton and Pittsburgh, both 5 seeds taken out, but especially Edmonton. I know they haven't had much success in the playoffs as of late, but I mean, them in Toronto, I thought there'd be a little more fuel because they're playing in their home arena. They didn't have to travel. They're not. I know they're still in a bubble and away from their families, but I mean, it's better than some of these teams that are in a different country away from their families right now. So really surprised, especially since the Maple Leafs kind of seem like they're going really turning upwards now ever since they got John Tavares, and they've still got Austin Matthews, who's a really electric young player. So big surprises there. My expectation, and we'll get into it in a few minutes, is that a team actually got into a physical fight, even given the coronavirus restrictions with the Astros, and that was the Oakland A's, after the A's had 5 times batters were hit in the series for Oakland by Houston pitchers. 3 times it was Ramon Laureano, who used to be a prospect with the Astros and was traded to Oakland, and he has done well in Oakland, but the hitting coach for the Astros seemed to kind of lead him on from the dugout, but Laureano made the bad decision of then charging at the coach, causing a fight. Nobody had masks on, lots of contact, a bunch of guys rolling around on the ground. So it's going to be interesting to see how the fallout comes, but not surprised. I expected at some point. I was honestly surprised that the thing with the Dodgers didn't get worse than it did, but the umpires did a great job of just, de-escalating that situation. But this time around, a completely different story. But Oakland looking really good. Houston down at 6-9. The A's have won 9 in a row. And finally, my conclusion, and I'm going to go to the NBA on this one, and that is that the Philadelphia 76ers, even though I picked them a couple weeks ago when they were healthy, they cannot get anywhere past like the second round with Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid leading the way. And once again, the injury bug is going to hurt them. They have had such an eventful time in the bubble. They've had a couple bad losses. They had the whole thing where Shake Milton and Joel Embiid got into a big argument during the game. You can't have 2 of your starters not on the same page. Then Ben Simmons has a loose body in his knee. He has to leave the bubble. And then Embiid, a really weird freak play, kind of bounces a little out of control trying to get a rebound, ends up turning his ankle, and he came out. So now we don't know how long they're going to be without Embiid. And currently they're the 6th seed and would have to face Boston in the first round, and the Celtics have looked really good in the bubble. So my conclusion, the 76ers, it's not going to work out this year, and I don't see it working out now with this group of guys that they can really go past maybe the Eastern Conference Finals at the best, get there. I don't see them getting to the NBA championship with Brett Brown as coach and Simmons and Embiid leading the way.
Yeah, I have to agree with you in that regard with the Philadelphia 76ers because I've never, Eddie, really even seen them as a result of a championship caliber team, even when they had Butler, for example. Because to me, in today's modern era, you can't turn around and play with a bunch of big men. You have to really have 4 guards on the floor and 1 big man. Now, I know the Lakers, I guess you could say, are a little bit of exception because LeBron James can play everywhere just like Ben Simmons can. Except obviously, Ben Simmons doesn't have range more than he says. Hey, I made 1 3. Congratulations. You still don't have range just because you made 1 shot. And, Embiid's a star. We know that. But It comes down to depth come playoff time. It comes down to how you mold as a unit. And they've looked terrible. I have no expectations for them come the playoffs. But I do want to start with my surprise. And last week when we talked about surprises, if I'm not mistaken, I talked about the Baltimore Orioles. Well, on the opposite side this week, I'm going to talk about the Miami Marlins. Through all the COVID such, and I know they just lost 2 in a row to the Mets, but who expected the Marlins to go on that early winning streak, win 6 consecutive games, and then turn around and yes, okay, they dropped 2 to the Mets, but still look really good. I'm actually somewhat convinced this year, Eddie, that the Miami Marlins may be competing for a playoff spot. Now, I know they have a long way to go. I believe it's 7-3 right now, but right now with the Mets struggling, and you look at the Phillies, depends on who they play and how they struggle. They could be looking competitive for that number 2 spot when it's all said and done. I mean, the Braves are the Braves. But if you can find a way to get right there and compete with the Nationals and the Phillies, you're looking really, really good. Now, you mentioned your expectations about or I should say what's expected with the fight. I'm going to go and turn around and go to the end of college football this time. And what's expected? Players saying they want to play football. I mean, it doesn't surprise me. You're a college athlete. You live for this. You want to go out, and this year you want to make money. But politics coming in, getting involved in every other thing, this doesn't surprise me. This is going to be an issue for the next 2-3 weeks. But if I'm being honest, and we've said it multiple times, the season is probably going to get canceled. But we knew this debate was coming, and ultimately that was expected. College football players are going to want to play, but schools, they're not going to want to play. And we're seeing more schools canceled day by day. And by the end of this week, I'm sure we'll see more conferences cancel their fall sports. So to me, again, this is absolutely no surprise at all, but expect some schools to try to capitalize. But I think it's the NCAA's job to step up and make a decision, which is ultimately what should be expected. And in recap, I mean, the way I look at it is this. Right now, we're in a bunch of games in professional sports that I guess you could say just don't really matter yet. But give it a week and a half, especially in the NBA bubble, things are about to pick up. Excitement is going to be before it was when we finally got sports back. And also with NFL training camps right around the corner, we're starting to get back to the part, Eddie, where all the sports are actually going to play together as one when this is all said and done very soon. And to me, that's something I've never seen in my lifetime. And I'm sure, obviously, you haven't either. So this should get very, very exciting very soon.
Only time we really ever see all 4 sports going is typically around Halloween, with the very end of the World Series for baseball, very beginning of the NBA, and then hockey and football going on. But how about this year? Fingers crossed everything works out with the NFL. I mean, I think they're going to play. We'll probably talk about this on a later show, how they're going to structure it. But think about this. Think about just starting with August 23rd when we've got the Indianapolis 500. And just it sets the course. In September and October, we have the NBA playoffs, the Stanley Cup playoffs, a pennant chase, and then the baseball playoffs leading up to the World Series. You've got the NFL season kicking into high gear. You've got 2 golf majors. You've got a tennis major. You've got the Kentucky Derby. You have the NASCAR playoffs. You have the IndyCar final few races. I mean, there is so much sports that is going to be going on. And really, overall, I guess I could add this in as a conclusion. Overall, I know there's a couple exceptions with the Cardinals and the Marlins, but sports are doing pretty well given the coronavirus concerns. We're now 2 weeks into really the return of competitive sports majorly, with baseball, basketball, and hockey all getting back into it. The NBA and the NHL are doing great jobs. Baseball, I know we've had a couple lapses with the Cardinals, with the Marlins. They're doing good, but this leads into the first thing, which is not so good. Astros-A's. It's just really a tough situation because the A's, they were trying to de-escalate things from the beginning when they decided that Mike Fiers, who was in line to pitch in this series, they'd start him one less day rest so he'd pitch against Texas and avoid going against Houston. And we all know Mike Fiers is the whistleblower who really leaked the story to The Athletic about the garbage can banging in 2017. And yeah, that was a smart decision on Oakland's part. And they, at least from what I saw, I know there were some Oakland players who months ago were not happy with Houston because think about it, the A's would have won the division a couple of times because they've been the AL West team that's been the next best. But they didn't really provoke anything in this series. It's not like Joe Kelly sticking his tongue out. Houston just started hitting their guys. And I don't know if any of these really were intentional at first, but Ramon Laureano got plunked 3 times in 2 days, twice by the same pitcher, Castellanos on the Astros. Like, I don't really understand the strategy there. But there was just so many things that went wrong for baseball there yesterday. First off, the Astros hitting coach pulling a Don Zimmer and trying to provoke a player to fight him. He starts pulling up. I was watching John Boy Media when he did his breakdown of it. Like, seriously, he starts, like, approaching him, pulling his shirt up, trying to look all tough. Like, seriously? He's trying to coax a player into a fight? Like, why? And there's a lot of rumors that he said things to Laureano. Like, he couldn't have thought he could just get away with that and not have something happen. So that's part one. Part two, Laureano, I mean, I know you were upset. You can't do that. You cannot just go and charge at a coach because, first off, just talking about this scenario now with coronavirus, because think about the Joe Kelly situation. And I feel like people are kind of ignoring this because everybody was all freaked out. Why did he get 8 games and everything? The reason why is because he provoked a benches clearing brawl. Honestly, I don't think the 8 games really had much to do with how he threw at Bregman and he threw at Correa. I think it's the fact that he got the benches to clear and break social distancing. Because guess what? If they had a problem with him throwing at their heads, he would have been tossed from the game. And he wasn't. He was disciplined afterwards after he got the entire Astros and Dodgers benches to clear and meet up on the third base line. So now Ramon Laureano does the same thing but worse because at least the Astros and Dodgers, there was just a lot of chirping going on. Here you actually had a fight. You had guys tackling each other. I mean, this is a pretty high-level baseball brawl. Fortunately, no punches thrown, but like there's going to be serious problems. So that's the second thing. So Laureano is in risk of getting a suspension. And the issue here too, the Oakland Athletics, you're outplaying the Astros right now. Maybe, people have been saying Houston, maybe it's because they don't know what's coming to them, but the Astros are 6-9 right now and are third place behind Texas in the AL West. And Oakland is 12-4. And Laureano is a big reason for that. He's one of their best defensive players. He's their best outfielder. And he really pairs well with that great infield they have with Olsen and Simeon and Chapman and a couple of power bats like Chris Davis and Chad Pinder. So, like, why? And you're going to end up getting suspended. If they gave Joe Kelly 8 games and he didn't charge anybody, he just made the face, Laureano could risk 10, 15 games here. And Oakland cannot afford to be without their star center fielder. Like, he's had major impact on the team. I remember his play last year when he robbed the home run and he threw it in for the double play. So that's the second problem here. Final thing that I noticed is the A's catcher, Austin Allen, comes in at the Astros catcher, Martin Maldonado, and just starts ripping off his mask. Like, seriously? He starts ripping off his catcher's mask? I mean, come on. That's the other problem here, too. I thought the other players would step in and try to de-escalate the situation because neither of these teams want guys to get suspended for COVID reasoning. One person I will give credit to is the Astros' Dustin Garneau because he took down Laureano before he could really start anything. But then you have Austin Allen charge in for Oakland and just try to escalate the situation again. And that's not going to help things. So he and Laureano, along with Dusty Baker, were rightfully ejected. I'm shocked they didn't eject the hitting coach, by the way, who's the one who provoked this whole thing. But Oakland, bad decision on your part. I know you're frustrated with the Astros, but guess what? Also, Ramon Laureano was not in the major leagues in 2017 when it was the height of all this. So, I mean, I know you're frustrated, but you can't risk throwing off a quarter of your season getting one of your best players suspended.
No, Eddie, I mean, I can agree on that regard, but you also have to remember this. Laureano was a prospect for the Houston Astros before he got traded to Oakland. Remember that too. So that was also an aspect where he may also personally feel that, hey, he plays for a team and, he was drafted by the Astros. All of a sudden now he's getting thrown at. And I understand his frustration. Getting hit 3 times in 2 days, not pretty, especially when it's by the same guy. But I am going to say this. Dave Hudgens, he deserves a suspension too. I'm not going to sit here and say Laureano's Mr. Perfect. He shouldn't have reacted that way, charged the dugout. But Dave Hudgens invoked the fight.
Mm-hmm.
Really, he was the starter. And if you're going to give Joe Kelly 8 games for creating a bench-clearing brawl, if Dave Hudgens just shut his mouth, guess what? Laureano's not charging. So I think that he should be held to the same account. But, hey, no Houston player or manager, should get suspended, right? I think he should get suspended the same amount of time as Laureano does. And Laureano's probably going to get suspended 10, 15 games. But listen, it should be that way. And then also Austin Allen, you mentioned him. I mean, the whole grabbing of Maldonado's mask, unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. He should get the same time as well of Laureano. But at the end of the day, this was unneeded. It could have been avoided. I understand Laureano's frustration because, again, this is a guy that came from this system and he turns around and now he's getting thrown at. And I know the Astros are frustrated. But guess what? Dusty Baker's your manager. If you expected to win with Dusty Baker, let's be honest. Your expectations are low then. Dusty Baker is a terrible, terrible manager. And some people will argue differently. Congratulations. I believe it was the Rangers he did good with years ago. But so what? One team doesn't change how your career is going. And sure, he's a manager now of a team that's an utter disaster because he can't get them under control. This is just the beginning of the Astros. This is 2 incidents now where if you really think about it, in the past, 3 weeks, just wait until the end of the season. You're going to have 5, 6 teams having issues with them. And I just see this again being the beginning, Eddie.
I will say Dusty Baker is past his prime when it comes to his managerial career. I mean, I'm surprised because Washington wasn't the best with him. He made the playoffs with them a couple of times, but he's not a terrible manager. He was better in the past. I mean, with the Reds, he had a good squad with them. He was a good manager with the Giants, but he was all the way back then before Bruce Bochy. But then again, that was many, many years ago. But I feel like he's just there in Houston as a placeholder because I was talking to my dad about this, and AJ Hinch and Alex Cora, I know they're both suspended. Supposedly Alex Cora is still going to the Red Sox, headquarters and stuff and everything. He's still showing up. I wouldn't be surprised if we see both these guys back with their teams next year, especially Cora, because his thing, I mean, the problem with Alex Cora is that, he had ties with the Houston situation and the Boston situation, but what the Red Sox did with just him there was definitely not nearly as egregious as the Astros. This Dusty Baker idea that he's going to be like their next manager for a long time, I think he's really just a 60-game placeholder here. But at the same time, he's got to get control of his guys because you can't have your pitchers throwing at Ramon Laureano 3 times in 6 at-bats. It's not something. It's not like it's a fluke and the coincidence that he got hit a bunch of times. It was clearly intentional. It was like first pitch of the at-bat twice that he got clunked with a pitch. And just because it was a curveball or a slider does not mean there wasn't intent. Because think about the curveball that Joe Kelly threw. That I think that was the one that it sailed over by Bregman. Seriously. But let's move forwards now to college football because this has been a very interesting day. The 5 power conferences, the Power 5, have gotten together and they made a statement about how basically they want to play, but at the same time they also had this conference call where they talked about what if the season gets canceled. And of course, that has caused a lot of some outrage, a bunch of people just speaking out, and a lot of decisions have been prompted from this. There's been a couple other FBS schools. Old Dominion was the first one earlier today, that with the Power Five rumoring that they wouldn't even play, that they've already now canceled their football season. And I mean, I expect a lot of these smaller conference like the WAC, the Midwest Conference, I mean, the Mountain West, the MAC already canceled their season. So these group of five conference teams, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see more of them cancel their seasons. But we've seen Trevor Lawrence, Justin Fields, arguably two of the best players in college football and two of the big draft prospects, outspoken saying, we want to play. Coach O went on Fox News again today, and, his whole thing, go Tigers and everything about we need football, the typical Coach O. But here's the deal. If you want to play college football here, you've got to create a system that is from team to – it's not just a team-by-team basis. It's got to be instituted by the NCAA to ensure that players are kept safe. Because there has been practices before for some of these teams. Coach O, I know you said, supposedly, that football is the quote-unquote bloodline of the United States. Well, it can't be the bloodline if 20 of your players are testing positive in workouts 2 months before the season starts. Dabo Swinney in Clemson has had a bit of trouble. Lincoln Riley in Oklahoma. I live 10 minutes away from Rutgers. They had to quarantine the entire team 2 weeks ago because there were 4 positive tests amongst players. So you can't avoid it. This is going to be a problem that's going to continue. So the NCAA here really has to step up and try to mandate things. But the problem now is that there are schools that do not want to play. There are Power 5 schools because the Big Ten did a vote. And, 11 of the 14 Big Ten schools said that they were considering not playing if they had the option. The only 3, Michigan, Iowa, and Nebraska. Everybody else showed some hesitation. Ohio State was on the fence. Everybody else is pretty strict about, no, we don't feel comfortable playing at this point. And I was just thinking, this really shows how, red state, blue state really even comes into play in college football. Because the SEC, everybody wants to play in the SEC. And I mean, that's down south. And, they've been a little more lax when it comes to COVID. But think about the Big Ten, which is based out of several major northern cities, which have had their own outbreaks of coronavirus, but have mandated masks and have been able to suppress them. And the last thing they want is another outbreak starting because they rushed to college football. Now, we've even seen President Donald Trump now quote tweet Trevor Lawrence about how we want college football to play. But you can't do that safely unless the NCAA, and this is where Mark Emmert, who, I mean, people say Roger Goodell's been quiet during this whole coronavirus thing. Mark Emmert has not said very much, especially with NCAA, which is a more touchy subject, I'd argue, than any professional sport, because you're also still dealing with college students here. These are not professional athletes. These are college students that are college students first and athletes second. In the case for 95% of them, the only exceptions are the ones that know they're going to the NFL. And they want the opportunity to play. I'm not going to argue with them that they shouldn't get that. But what I'm saying is that the NCAA needs to institute a way to make sure that these games are done safely. Because they cannot run the risk. They can't do what baseball's doing right now. Because we've already heard in baseball, you've seen teams and players that are not abiding. The Marlins, the Nationals going out to clubs. And guess what? Pardon me, not the Nationals, the Cardinals. And what happens? They get a major outbreak on their team. And parallel that with college football with 4 times as many personnel and with college kids who we talked about last week. College kids are not going to just abide by some rules. Like the NCAA needs to be strict. Can they do a bubble for football? No, because there's so many people. That's so tremendously difficult. But how they do this, they have to be very careful. Certainly no fans. But this is going to be a tough situation. And if certain schools choose to not play, there's been rumors now about Michigan switching to the Big 12 or the SEC for a year if the Big 10 chooses not to play. This is just going to cause so much chaos.
Yeah, I think it's very, I guess I would have to say dumb, that a school, like I can understand, for example, if you're an independent conference, like for example, Notre Dame, then I can understand why you switch because you don't technically play in a conference. So I get moving them into a conference for 1 year. But if you're a part of a conference and most of your conference, again, chooses not to play, you shouldn't be allowed to move. You should just be done and sit there, and that's it. Now, it's funny. You mentioned the SEC, for example, how they all want to play. Well, I do want to remind you one thing. There's a man in the SEC, specifically for Alabama, and he goes by the name of Nick Saban. This is the same guy who cut people from his football team, in particular when he was the coach of the Miami Dolphins. He cut a player from his team because he went to his father's funeral. Nick Saban, he doesn't care about coronavirus. He'll play through COVID. If his players have COVID, he'll tell them to come to the football field, and he'll still turn around and say, hey, if you don't play, you're sitting the bench, or you're not going to be on my football team anymore, because that's the kind of person he is. It's been proven that way. But you look at other teams that care about the situation. These are the teams that care more about the future. And I understand some teams, they want to make their money. They want to turn around. They want to play football. But sometimes you have to look at the bigger picture. And unfortunately, it just hasn't been that way. There's a lot of these guys. For example, I understand Trevor Lawrence wants to take advantage of an opportunity to prove that he's going to be the number one draft pick and turn around and make a lot of money this year in revenue because he essentially now, in terms of players, is the face of college football. But unfortunately, again, if there's no plan, the NCAA isn't going to improve it. And you have to be careful. You have to be tactical about how you go for it. And I agree with you as well, Eddie, in regards of a bubble's not going to work. Too many people involved, too many parties. You need to keep everything, in my opinion, within state to open up. And then if they're traveling, let's say you have teams from that state traveling as a whole together to minimize, for example, the issue with Major League Baseball, teams going from state to state every single day of the week. And I get they only play 1 week, or I should say 1 day of the week, which is understandable, but you need to minimize that flow going from state to state. So if they make a schedule, it's going to have to be state-wise, I think, Eddie, in regards to how they move them so that it's not like, for example, let's say Texas travels all the way, to an SEC game, and you have, I don't know, someone from the Mountain West Conference coming across the country, because that's just not going to work out. You need to keep it regional. You need to keep it careful. And I think that'll really help the COVID numbers if these players want to play. But when it's all said and done, if you're the Big Ten especially, or the SEC, it doesn't matter what conference you're in at this point, you need to come to a consensus as a whole, and you need to come up with a plan, even if you aren't a part of this process as a team and have opted out, because it's going to take everyone to agree, not just one group.
And you mentioned how restricting travel, which is, the teams have already decided with the SEC, the Big Ten, the Pac-12, conference-only schedules. That certainly helps. But I want to wrap up with this. You mentioned Nick Saban and some of these other powerhouse college coaches. I'm going to give John Harbaugh a lot of credit, where credit's due. Pardon me, Jim Harbaugh. I always get them mixed up. The Michigan coach, who was very adamant about how University of Michigan could potentially play football this year because they've been open since June 13th with daily workouts, and he has a whole listing of all their safety precautions, and they have not had one positive COVID test. So kudos to him. He's doing a good job with it. But think about it, Nick Saban, a Dabo Sweeney, Ed Ogeron, these power coaches, and I think we can all agree, there are situations where they put football first before basically anything else. And that's a problem that, if that's your coaching tactic most years, okay. If that helps you win, okay. Maybe that helps these players become more of a winning mentality and prioritize their job. But this year, you have to adjust because with everything going on with coronavirus, with the fact that you have players, and this is the other myth that people think, that if you're 20 years old, that you cannot have any problem with COVID, that you're just going to have it, you'll test positive, you won't have any symptoms. Guess what? Fortunately, a lot of the athletes who have had it have been just fine. But there's been other ones. I'll name Eduardo Rodriguez, the Red Sox number 2 starter, who's going to have to miss the whole year because he had COVID, and now he has a heart issue that has developed from it. There's been other college players who have developed heart and lung issues after having COVID, and you don't want to run the risk of that, especially when, I mean, let's be honest, you've got offensive linemen that are over 300 pounds that are going to be trying to play out there in hot weather, and you don't want the same situation that we saw in Maryland 2 years ago, where their coach had to be fired after pushing a guy too hard and he collapsed and passed away on the field during a practice 2 years ago. So that, you don't want that. And then, of course, Colorado State, who there was also the whole situation with them that they were threatening players about that they have to play, regardless of any concerns about COVID. And then they had to suspend operations of their football team. This is why I feel like college football might be a little too complex to make it work. But I do trust some of these athletic directors that they can take control. And if we have the good coaches that are willing to put safety above football, like Jim Harbaugh, helping to lead the way, I have confidence that something can happen with college football. We're going to move into a couple quick discussion and debate topics before we wrap things up today. And I'm going to start in the NBA, where Saturday, I had fun watching sports because there were a couple really fun things to watch. We had the Xfinity Series at Road America, where it went into the rain, and a good cup race at Michigan. We had hockey, one of the best days in the NHL in the last couple of years, and a great finish where the Avalanche and the Golden Knights competed, and the Golden Knights ended up securing the number 1 seed in the Western Conference. But the game I had my eye on was the Denver Nuggets and the Utah Jazz, which I almost included in my C in the SEC recap until Joel Embiid got hurt yesterday. And that is that the Denver Nuggets are the only team that I've ever heard of that have an underrated superstar and an overrated team. Nobody thinks about Nikola Jokic as one of the top players in the NBA, but he is so talented, and his moves in the post, the fact that he can shoot threes, the fact that he can pass so well as a big man, people always tend to undervalue it. But the team itself, I mean, they had a 6-point lead with 21 seconds left in regulation. They blow that. There was a bad call by the officials. I'll give them that. But still, 6-point lead, they tie it. Then, overtime, 6-point lead, minute and a half to go, you blow that again. They did eventually win the game in double overtime because of a couple lucky shots by Murray and Craig, but this team is not very deep. I know they're tall and they have height, and that could help them beat Houston if they're against them, but a 7-game series, the last 2 years, they've come in as a favorite, and they can't pull it out. And I'm not saying Mike Malone's a bad coach, because honestly, I think he's a fine coach, but Jokic does not have enough talent around him. Jamal Murray's a solid player, but if Torrey Craig is your starting small forward, if Will Barton is in your starting lineup, Plumlee, I mean, this team has a lot of average guys, and average guys is not going to cut it in the Western Conference. And I could see the Nuggets having an early exit in the postseason.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, I have to agree because, Eddie, if you remember the past few podcasts, when we talked about teams that just don't have it on paper in terms of statistics, the Denver Nuggets are, a top 5 team in the conference. And last year they had one heck of a year. But I even mentioned in the past when, hey, you had Gallinari as your starter every single week in and out on the floor. This team, it just has a bunch of meaningless players that, yes, could play some good defensive basketball, but are as inconsistent as can be. And sure, they beat the Jazz in a close competitive game in which, again, they blew leads twice and had to a double overtime game. To me, the game was exciting. Overall, the Jazz, they've had a little bit of a tough time in the bubble, but to be fair, at the same time, they've mixed it up in terms of time with their units, and now they're preparing for a playoff series. And you got to see a good ending here. But you mentioned Jokic, for example. I mean, the guy is a star right now on the floor. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he had a double-double that game. I think it was 30 points, if I'm not mistaken. Turned around and had one heck of a game, proven to be that he is the man that really takes control on the floor for the Nuggets. But when we talk about playoff basketball, Eddie, You have to remember, only the specialist of players, and I'm not saying Jokic isn't special because he is, but the specialist of players can take over and dominate come the postseason. We haven't really gotten to see that in regards for him yet. I'm eager to see come the playoffs how he assembles a series, because you have to assume defensive adjustments and everything else for teams preparing based on who they may face in the first round, for example. You're going to see a lot more focus on him because, again, there's a lot of inconsistencies on the floor. When LeBron, for example, played for the Cleveland Cavaliers, why do you think the Cavs, to an extent, for the Golden State Warriors, were so easy to beat? Not just because they were a powerhouse team, but because the offense for the Cavaliers had so many inconsistencies. For example, J.R. Smith, or even their sixth man at the time, Rodney Hood, when they made a trade. He wasn't effective because they had guys that would come out and play, and they would play good one game, turn around, and they wouldn't be effective for the rest of the series. The same thing kind of falls for the Denver Nuggets. They have a good mix of a unit that can win games, but when it matters and you don't know who you can rely on outside of Jokic, that could be troublesome, which is why I have to agree. I see them getting through the first round, but definitely a second round exit.
Second debate topic of three. We're going to stay in the mountain area. The Colorado Rockies have the best record in Major League Baseball. 12-4, right up there with Oakland, with the Cubs, with the Yankees, and they are shockingly above the Dodgers as we reach the 1/3 mark already in the baseball season. Do you think they can stay up there and get a playoff spot, or maybe even win the division?
Yeah, you know what? I think for Colorado, last year was a letdown because you have to remember the year prior, they were a really good ball club that was competing for wins and, turning around and looked to be actually a major threat come the postseason. But last year they had a step down. And the offense for Colorado, we know, especially in that air, is always going to be consistent. But the main thing for them this year in particular has been the pitching. It seems like everyone right now for the Rockies, for the most part, have been pitching well. The bullpens work for them, the starting rotations, giving them some good innings, and they've had a very good start. Now, don't get me wrong, Eddie, because we've turned around in past years and we've seen good starting teams fall apart and really have their seasons come to an end eventually. But right now, they're looking really good. Obviously, we know the Dodgers are another good team out there in the West, but I don't know. After that, the Diamondbacks aren't promising. The Giants still, to me, are nowhere near a playoff team. So it really comes down to how the Padres continue to play as well, which, by the way, the Padres as well look pretty good right now. But I think this continues for Colorado. They look really good. The offense is clicking. The pitching is clicking. If they can keep this up, Eddie, for another week and a half, I think it's safe to say that they're going to be in the playoffs.
Yeah, I think they're going to be in the playoffs. I still think the Dodgers might catch them for the division eventually. I think the Dodgers are just such a great team. And as they get healthier, I know they got a couple guys on the injured list right now, and Betts was banged up a little bit. They're going to figure things out. But the Rockies, with their pitching, has looked excellent. I mean, German Marquez, Kyle Freeland, who, I mean, what a roller coaster career. 2 years ago, he was, I think, third in the Cy Young voting, was in the finals with Scherzer and DeGrom. And then last year has one of the worst ERAs in the National League, but then battles back. So far this year has been strong. Tyler Anderson, another strong pitcher. Their bullpen has been solid. They have a couple older guys there, but it hasn't really phased them. And the National League, I want to be honest, there was a lot of weak pitching staffs in the National League that if they can get into the postseason, and if they can get Anderson, Freeland, and Marquez lined up in the postseason as their three guys, they could be a force to be reckoned with, because in the NL East, I'm just going to name some of these National League teams. Right now, the Miami Marlins have the most consistent pitching staff of the 5 teams in the National League East. The Braves had to DFA one of their starters. Washington, everybody's hurt and old. The Phillies don't really have much to show. They have to have their offense carry them, and sometimes their offense doesn't really stand up. And then the Mets, I mean, Jacob deGrom is arguably the best pitcher in baseball. But what do you have after that? And Seth Lugo is your only somewhat trustworthy arm. And the NL Central, the Cardinals are basically dead, so forget about them. The Brewers have a couple decent starters, but they've taken a step back. The Reds don't have a good bullpen. The Cubs are pretty good with their staff. and Pittsburgh's brutal. And then the West, San Diego's got a decent pitching staff. Like you mentioned, the Padres, I think we could get 3 from the NL West in the playoffs because Tatis Jr. and Machado and Hosmer have been good on offense. But their pitching staff with Paddock and Lamet leading the way has been excellent as well. Arizona, Mad Bum got killed yesterday basically by the Padres offense, and they don't have much after that, and San Francisco's a mess. So the Rockies, I'd argue, have one of the top 5 pitching staffs maybe in the major leagues right now, and definitely one of the top ones in the National League, and I think they could carry that going forwards. Last thing today is going to be NASCAR because we had 2 races at Michigan, and I want to start first off with Kevin Harvick, with how he performed dominating basically the weekend. I know yesterday he got some help when Keselowski and Blaney took each other out, but Tim, do you think Harvick is the championship favorite at this point?
It's really hard between both him and Denny Hamlin because, like these past few years where there was a big 3 forming, well, you turn around and these guys have dominated to this point in the year, and Harvick has started to come to life. I mean, for me personally, Eddie, I think it would be wrong if I said Kevin Harvick wasn't the favorite, considering the fact that he's been in the Final Four every single year since this playoff format has been created. So, I mean, to me, I would like to see he's a favorite, but again, it still feels this year like it's not going to be one of those guys. Like how Joey Logano a few years ago wasn't a part of that big 3 and walked away with a championship. This year, I still feel it could go that way. Earlier on when we first started the podcast, Eddie, I mentioned where I felt like this was a Hendrick kind of year. To an extent, I still feel like this is a Hendrick year, but it's not going to be Jimmy Johnson. It's not going to be Alex Bowman, who faded away. But I still feel like Chase Elliott has a really good chance to prove something. He's shown some speed. I know Michigan didn't necessarily get the best of results, but he was competing for a win, in the first race, and then turned around the second race again, didn't necessarily get it done. But I think the biggest thing to watch when you really look at it is how do the Penske cars do? For example, if you have Brad Keselowski wrecking his own teammates like he did in race 2 in Michigan, it's not going to work out. Because it's driving, as hard as you can to try to win. But as we know, how this works for all the Penske cars in the past, someone's going to be in a hole in the round of 8 trying to make it to the championship 4. It happens every year in a must-win situation. They drive over their head and then create more issues for themselves. So I'm eager to see how Penske handles their playoff run. But again, going back to the Harvick situation, I mean, it would be unfair for me to say that he isn't the favorite, but I just still don't see him winning the championship, nor Denny Hamlin.
Yeah, I agree with you at this point because I think Hamlin has been so consistent, and Harvick has his title. Hamlin has been due, and Hamlin has been close so many times in the last 10 years and has really been the class of JGR this season. And guess what? If there's still not going to be practice going forwards, what can you expect from these guys like Logano or Kyle Busch or Truex that bank on practice to be more successful? So if you wipe them out of the picture, I mean, I still have a little bit of faith, though, in Truex. I know he only has 1 win this season, but he's so good at every track in the playoffs. His best part of the schedule are the tracks that are in the postseason. So he's the type of guy who could really come through, but he's had a slow start to the year. But you mentioned Penske, and I like Keselowski. I know he took out Blaney yesterday, but he's quietly been up there many times this season. He's got 3 wins. He's been consistent. He and Blaney, I think, could have a chance. And if Ryan Blaney could steal a championship, I think that would be huge for Penske. If he's trying to build a legacy, and then him, Keselowski, and Logano each have 1. And Keselowski wants to break through and get to his 2nd title because think about how many guys now have 1 championship in the Cup Series. You've got Kurt Busch, you've got Keselowski, Logano, Truex, Harvick. Those are 5 guys. Kyle Busch got his 2nd. These guys want to catch Kyle Busch. So one of them, I think, could definitely try to go for that 2nd title, but you never know when you get to the postseason. Last thing for today, the big news in NASCAR, Eric Jones will not be returning to Joe Gibbs Racing, as Levine Family Racing is basically, I mean, they're basically going to be done. They're selling their assets. Wouldn't be surprised if Rick Ware Racing ends up with them and they've got another team. But fact of the matter is, Bell's probably going to JGR. I think we can all agree on that. where do you see Erik Jones in 2021? Because he's been decent this year. He's probably going to get a good ride. Where do you think he's going to be?
It's split in where I think he's going to go because a lot of people say, hey, he's going to go to the 48. He's going to be the guy that replaces Jimmy Johnson. But somewhere in my heart, I still don't feel like that's going to be the case. I mean, you look at a couple rides that could be opening up. That 14, for example, could be one of them. We also don't really know what's going on because if I'm not mistaken, Cole Custer's deal was a 1 year, and Custer's going to be a part of Stewart-Haas, but we just don't know in regards, hey, maybe they'll switch him to the 14. Maybe the 41 car becomes available. So there's a lot of, but there could be a lot of things Stewart-Haas could try, for example. Another thing that we forget too, Penske, yes, they have 3 cars. Maybe they expand to a 4th car. There's a lot of things that haven't been brought into the equation. And I don't want to say I see him going to Hendrick. Right now, that's the favorable spot. But he's going to be going to a good team. And there's another solid driver, in my opinion, that also may not be returning to his spot, and that's back to Benedetto. The 21 doesn't seem to be guaranteed for him to come back next year. Could you see that car maybe becoming yet again the full-born Penske merger as it already is? And maybe you see Erik Jones going there. I just don't quite know. But, Eddie, what it really comes down to is what sponsorship does he bring with him? Because at the end of the day, if he doesn't bring a heavy sponsorship, he's probably not going to be going anywhere major. And based upon the whole Bubba Wallace situation that we talked about last week of, hey, is he going to stay with Petty or go to Ganassi? That's a whole different thing too, because Bubba, for example, is a big sponsor in McDonald's. He can make a big impact on a Ganassi team. But Erik Jones doesn't bring that sponsorship. And for a team like Hendrick that's lacking sponsors as it is, it may not be beneficial.
Yeah, that's the concern with Erik Jones, because think about how Hendrick's already in this tough boat with Alex Bowman driving a Chevy half the weeks. And he's an even better driver than Erik Jones. I mean, he's got in the victory lane this season. Jones has not. Jones is still on the outside looking in when it comes to the playoffs. But what I do see with Erik Jones is a laid-back personality, a talented driver that still has the room to peak and become a better driver, because this is still just his 4th year. And he reminds me a lot of Jimmy Johnson. I don't think he's as good as Jimmy Johnson, certainly, but he has a lot of the same traits. Now, the question is also, what happens with Ally with their sponsorship deal with Hendrick Motorsports? Because if they simply go and instead back Erik Jones, it would just be the same thing as having the 48 there with Jimmy Johnson. But question is, what happens when Jimmy leaves? What does Ally do? And like you said, what can Erik Jones bring to the table? Because what I see is the difference between Erik Jones and Christopher Bell. Christopher Bell has grabbed himself a couple of sponsors that Erik Jones actually drove in the past and have made them his own. Rheem is one of them. That's now one of his major sponsors, and used to be Jones's car back in the day with JGR and Xfinity and with KBM and trucks before Bell came along. So he has sponsorship to help him, and that's what JGR wants. And you mentioned Bubba Wallace. He's got McDonald's. Honestly, I'm going to just give you my quick little rundown of some predictions at this point. I think Bubba's going to the 42. I think Kenseth is going to be done. This package has not worked out for him. And it's Bubba and Kurt Busch with Ganassi, and that could be a decent team. I still think Erik Jones might be able to get the funding together to go to Hendrick Motorsports. And I think Ally's going to stay and back Jones. And he might be able to bring over a sponsor or two from JGR. I don't know who, maybe like Reezers or something. I know Stanley's not going anywhere because they've been with them since Carl Edwards. I don't think DeWalt's going to follow Erik Jones over to Chevy, but interesting to consider. I still think DiBenedetto's going to stay in the 21. I know people – the problem with DiBenedetto, I know it's a little different just to say this too, but people had too many high expectations for Matty D. He's still doing good. He's still getting that Wood Brothers car, which with Paul Menard was not in this position. He's going to get them into the playoffs, I think. He's still got a decent cushion. He still runs well and runs consistently in the top 10 a lot of these races. But people had these expectations that he was going to become the star just automatically just because he finished second to Hamlin at Bristol last year. Like, calm down. It's DiBenedetto. He needs a couple more years to really reach stardom if he's going to get there, but I don't think the 21, they should just sour on him. And how about if that would be that he'd be in his 5th different car in 5 years? But lot to consider, lot to see. And NASCAR is going to be fun this weekend at the Daytona Road Course. That's probably going to be a mess, but sports are getting exciting. Also, congratulations to Colin Morikawa on winning the PGA Championship this past weekend. Had a great run over there in California to get his first major, just shy of his 24th birthday. We will be back with another edition of Sports Speak on Thursday. Until then, I'm Eddie Kalegi.
And I'm Tim Moore.
And we'll see you next time.